Lord, I want to be a Christian into my heart. Lord, I want to be like Jesus into my heart. Take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to Thee. Take my moments and my days. Let them flow in ceaseless praise. Take my hands and let them move at the impulse of Thy love. Take my feet and let them be swift and beautiful for Thee. Really? Do we really mean those verses and the others we sing? Do we really want to give our entire lives away to God? Are we really willing to leave everything and follow where Jesus leads us? Do we grasp the depth of the meaning of those hymns and others like them? And before you say out loud, yes, we do, I want to caution you a little bit about answering too quickly. Because to say yes will require being part of a revolutionary way of living that will be absolutely contrary to conventional cultural wisdom, even that of some folks who claim and call themselves Christians. You see, the operative question here is, do we really know what we're saying? Do we really know what we're asking? When I was in the 6th grade, every time there was a space launch, our teacher, Mrs. Cochran, would turn the television in our classroom to the news so we could watch the Mercury astronauts take off. Now, for those of you who are under the age of 62, which is how old I am, there was a time when shooting a human being into outer space, have them circle the Earth, come back safely, talk about it, was absolutely amazing and mind-blowing. It would be like tweeting someone on Mars today. And when we would watch, we would find the smoke and the fire billowing up, encompassing the bottom of the rocket, and slowly it began to lift off, and our eyes would open wide, and we say, wow, that's what I want to do when I grow up. And Mrs. Cochran always asked us, do you really know what you're saying? You see, we only saw the spectacular in the liftoff, the orbiting the Earth, where one could see the Earth from a very unique place. The excitement of splashdown and getting out of the capsule, the celebrity of people cheering the ticker tape parades and knowing we were only one of a handful of people, very few people in the entire world who got to do that. Do you really know what you're saying? Mrs. Cochran would always ask us. And of course, what she wanted to do through her question was to get us to think about all it took to become an astronaut. First was the in-depth education in science and math beyond high school, beyond a simple 4-year degree. Then came the disciplined training of becoming an aircraft pilot, perhaps being a test pilot, where each day you would risk your life. And after that, if we had the physical, emotional, and all the other training behind us, we still needed to be chosen to participate in the space program with no guarantees that our hard work and our discipline would land us in a spacecraft. We saw the spectacular. We did not even think about the disciplined, day-to-day hard work leading to the spectacular. In many ways, Mrs. Cochran's words would be the question we'd like to ask Job. Because Job had been complaining about his situation and wanting God to come down and let's have a chat about what you have done to me here. You know, talk to me. God, I have a complaint. I want to air it. I want to tell you. Chapter 38, God shows up. Those are the questions that God asks Job. In many of the same ways, you see, he did not understand what he was asking. But Mrs. Cochran's words also echo Jesus' words to John and James. Do you know what you're asking? When Jesus asked them if they can drink the cup that he will drink, and be baptized with the baptism he will be baptized, I often wonder, are they thinking the cup is a joy of salvation and that wonderful sense of peace? Are they thinking the baptism is simply the purification ritual commonly practiced by the Jewish people of the first century? I know they enthusiastically shout, "We are able!" A first century precursor to the contemporary "yes, we can," or to the stopping to do the T-bowing movement becomes so popular. But I have to ask Jesus this question, do we really know? Do they really know what they're asking? Do they really know what they are saying? What would happen if Jesus had simply said, "Okay, you can be on my right and you can be on my left"? Imagine for a moment what happens the next week. They enter Jerusalem with Jesus. Throngs of people line the way to the city gate. Perhaps John and James get to walk right next to Jesus on the way in. The crowds are cheering, they're shouting, they're waving their palm branches. Ah, yes, the conquering king has arrived. John and James are feeling pretty important as they walk through the city gates in what is a first century ticker tape parade. And when Jesus chases the money changers and the sellers of sacrificial animals out of the temple, perhaps James and John join in. They'd feel full of power and authority on that moment. And all during the week, they'd sit on Jesus' right and on his left as he debates and teaches the scribes and the priests of the temple. And before the Seder meal on that Thursday evening, Jesus would hand them each a towel so they could join him in washing the disciples' feet. Not really a big deal. You know, it's act as a slave or a servant in a sort of symbolic gesture. Sort of like what we Christians do on Maundy Thursdays. Once every 10 years or so, or if we ever do it at all. So it seems pretty easy to do. And they may not realize that when Jesus says one of the disciples will betray him, and that his blood will be poured out and his body is broken, that it has really anything to do with them. Until the soldiers come to arrest Jesus. And John and James are arrested with him. And they're taken to the chief priests for questioning, and then taken to Pilate for more questioning, and finally the trial and the conviction, and they begin to feel the sting of the jeers, the humiliation of being mocked and spat upon, the cutting pain of the whip across their backs as the Roman soldiers prepare to walk them up to Golgotha. And perhaps they'll be given symbols of their honor and power and status, just as Jesus is given a crown of thorns to wear by the Roman soldiers who mockingly call him King of the Jews. And at sunrise, they walk through the city up the hill as crowds gather to watch, to jeer, to weep. And they feel the rejection, the abandonment Jesus feels as he walks up the hill carrying his cross, because they are carrying their own crosses up to Golgotha. And at the top of the hill, as Jesus is being nailed to his cross, they are being nailed to theirs. Jesus is in the middle, and John and James are on his right-hand side and on his left-hand side. Did they really know what they were asking? But Jesus, being Jesus, does not say yes to their request. Because I suspect he knows that all of the disciples are still blind to exactly what it means to follow him. And none of them grasp what Jesus is really about. Mark's gospel brings the clarity of the disciples' blindness to us. From the moment that Peter rightly confesses Jesus is Messiah, and then in the very next moment protests loudly when Jesus tells them for the very first time that he is going to Jerusalem to suffer, be humiliated, die on a cross, and be raised after 3 days. All the way up to this moment when John and James ignite conflict among the disciples with their ambition. Every step toward Jerusalem is a step toward the realization that the disciples do not get what Jesus is talking, that Jesus isn't just talking about simply a change in who is making the rules within the established structures of kingdom power. Rather, Jesus is talking about a completely new world order when all nations are to be brought under God's perfect rule in an era of universal justice and compassion, the administration of which will naturally belong and be in the hands of those who humble themselves, who empty themselves to serve only God's will and not their own. And the problem for the disciples, you see, is they really don't know anything about that kind of rule. They only know one way of ruling a kingdom, the way Rome and Herod the Great ruled kingdom. And that way of doing kingdom was to use coercive power aimed at getting what the emperor or Herod wanted done with the least amount of resistance. But if there was resistance, then Rome and Herod would bring swift, merciless, coercive, and violent power down upon those who resisted, so people would have a certain knowledge that resistance would be ended. This way of doing kingdom was based upon the king garnering power and wealth at the expense of nearly everybody else. It was playing one group off another group. It was supersizing public buildings to breed anonymous, impersonal crowds who were motivated by the bread and circuses buying their opinions and support. Election. I'm sorry. I just could not do that. Because that would make them easier to control. It was doing kingdom the way despots and oppressive kings and dictators have always done kingdom. From Pharaoh to Hitler to Stalin to Putin to Ayatollahs to Assad in Syria to Mubarak in Egypt to the Taliban in Afghanistan to the various ruling juntas throughout the world, some of which our own government throughout time and place has supported and placed in power. Jesus, however, came to turn that way of doing kingdom upside down. And this meant more than simply a regime change, as some have described it. Instead, it was more like Eden restored, the new Jerusalem of the prophets descending from heaven, God's kingdom on earth with restorative justice, compassion, an abundant life, and a sustainable life for all creation, marked by a trust in God, yielding an unflagging commitment to God's intention for creation by revolutionaries who follow Jesus. It is a kingdom of being known by name, of small groups of people sharing not simply their possessions, but themselves within a community of mutuality. It is a community of powerful allies seeking what is best for each person, while celebrating the abilities of each person and recognizing the community's need for every person's abilities. It is a kingdom where leaders seek to serve and not to be served, which is still a radical concept. Not only is it radical by comparison to the way governments throughout the world govern, but by the way the church has, down through time, been organized. You see, no sooner had the Constantine declared that it was legal to be a Christian than the church took upon itself all the trappings of the emperor's court, including the hierarchical structure and the need to control doctrine and stop resistance. That was, in part, what the Reformation sought to change, was shared authority in governance by those ordained to governance, elders, by those who are ordained to teaching, leading worship, celebrating the sacraments, pastor, and celebrating and those ordained to a ministry of empathy, compassion, and witness, deacons. John Calvin would insist, as Jesus did, that the life of disciples was not just lived within the bounds of the faith community 1 hour a week, but would permeate business and government, law, courts, schools, and homes, as each person sought to serve and not to be served. Yet we still haven't lived fully into what it means to be a servant leader. And I often wonder if we know that a servant leader's highest priority is the other person's well-being. That the outcome is for those who are being served to grow as persons, to be healthier, wiser, encouraged to be seekers of God's way, and then themselves to become servant leaders. And also the servant leader is persuasive and inviting, not coercive, does not seek power, does not seek to control others. The servant leader is an attentive listener, aware that words and actions very often have a physical effect as well as an emotional one. And the servant leader has a direction founded upon faith, centered in God, and states it positively. Well, we're going to go this way to do this thing. The servant leader knows also when to withdraw and reorient oneself. And the servant leader accepts a person as a person, but doesn't accept all their behavior. Baptist tradition I sort of had some time with growing up would say it this way: love the sinner, but hate the sin. And the servant leader has an awareness of the world that opens the doors of perception so that the person may get more out of their experience. The servant leader thinks of the current moment as containing past, present, and future in one organic unity. And finally, the servant leader searches for wholeness and engages in this search with others. Francis of Assisi, who took Jesus very seriously, put it this way in his famous prayer: O divine Master, grant that I may not seek so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. So when we sing, Lord, I want to be a Christian in my heart, take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee. Take my moments and my days, let them flow in ceaseless praise. For I, the Lord of sea and sky, have heard my people cry. All who dwell in dark and sin, who will bear my light to them? Whom shall I send? Here I am, Lord. I would hope that we would have the humility and courage to be the transformed person God is creating us to be by stepping out to follow after Jesus in the day-to-day, very hard work of understanding, consoling, loving, giving, pardoning, of being those who come to serve and not to be served. Amen.